Okay. Welcome to our webinar on rethinking data discovery with a privacy lens. I am really honored to be here today with Greg Martin, the solution architect of the most innovative startup of RSA 2020, Securiti.AI. Greg has an extensive background in both cybersecurity and data-centric technologies, over a decade in architecting and deploying data loss prevention programs and supporting technologies for some of the world's largest enterprises. Greg compliments me very nicely. I am Terry Roberts, a global cyber risk and cyber intelligence professional with over 20 years at the executive level across government, academia, and industry. And for the past 5 years, the CEO and founder of the first risk-based cybersecurity online exchange, WhiteHawk, providing cyber risk SaaS platform services to companies and organizations of all sizes. We want to kick this off so that we can get to both the substance and to any questions that you have. Please don't be shy, and with all Zoom Q&A, simply type into the Q&A panel window, and we will work to ensure we get to address as many questions as we can. So with that, I must admit, Greg, as I turn it over to you, one of my thoughts was that I have been amazed by how few companies that I have worked with as we help them migrate to the cloud, that they didn't have that all-important data classification framework in place first. So I'm looking forward to hearing the smart way of approaching both your data and privacy.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And that's a great point that you make, is that people fail to understand that data classification, and they figure, oh, well, I'll figure it out after I move to the cloud. When then they realize that they're now under the gun to to remove a bunch of data that they just put out into the cloud that shouldn't have been there. So what I like to do is start by just demystifying this whole sense of that people think of data protection, data classification, data privacy. You know, what's the relation between them, and where are the overlaps, and where are the lines drawn? So what I like to do is break these programs into just 3 separate and distinct programs. We start with your data classification program, and then you can move into data loss prevention, data privacy. But here, I like to break down exactly the functions of each one of these, because people often kind of lump them together into just one data program. So I usually like to start with data classification, and this is very, very high level, just understanding your data sensitivity levels. Basically, you know, is this a confidential file, or is this a public file? And then really define your rules around how you actually have to handle that data. So once I've decided what the data is, what am I supposed to do with it? Encrypt it, or is this something that can be freely emailed? And then maybe go into the technology, implementing a technology, and do stuff like, hey, when I create a file, I should force my users to select exactly what classification this file falls into. And then one interesting thing I like to add about this is data classification is sometimes driven by regulations or by the industry you're in. Sometimes you have no choice. You have to follow a certain data classification model. Or if you're just in, say, you manufacture widgets, you may be able to come up with your own data classification scheme. So there's some very distinct rules around data classification there. Then what I like to think of is I need to have that basis before I move into something like data loss prevention. Because if you look at this, you need to already define what is sensitive data before you can get to the phase of, hey, preventing disclosure of that sensitive data. Because if you're struggling to figure out what is sensitive data in a DLP program, then you're never going to have a successful program. You need to already have that fundamental understanding. Then it's also a case of same thing when I'm thinking about access to that data. If you're minimizing access through your DLP controls, you still need to understand and have a good understanding what is your actual sensitive data, or your most sensitive or critical data. And then in the end, what you're doing is really enforcing those guidelines that you set up in your data classification program. So it's almost like you need to have these soft policies in data classification, and then your hard enforcement with DLP. Then if I move into data privacy, now a data privacy program is going to be very different than your classification and DLP. Because here, you're very specifically interested in personal data flows, not necessarily what's most critical to the business, but actual personal data. Because that personal data, that's not something that the company owns. They're only a steward of that data. So they need to very carefully map out the flow of where they're capturing personal data, where it's getting stored. Still need to make sure that they're preventing and minimizing preventing disclosure and minimizing access, but they also need to catalog the exact purpose of why they even have that data, how is it being processed, or if they share it, are those third parties that they're sharing it to also putting the proper guidelines in place. So there's a lot of things you need to understand, but you still need to have this basis of data classification and all that data loss prevention and protection. And in the end, it's all because you have this responsibility to actually maintain the rights of the users that you collect that data from. You need to actually honor those rights on all of that data. So I'll definitely get into that as I go a little bit further.
So Greg, I do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I think one that'll be a good segue to your next topic. Do I need different software for each of these programs?
Well, the funny thing is you don't necessarily need different software, but there are definitely software vendors that fit into each of these categories. Now, each of these categories, you really need, these are all about having the proper processes, people, and technology in place. So with data classification, you should have the proper processes to actually classify and create new data types. You need to be educating your people in your organization to actually use those classification types. And then you need that technology to actually do the enforcement. It's very similar on data loss prevention and almost more important in data privacy. You need to have the processes of gathering all of the information about the data that you're sharing and saving. You need to have your proper people trained on how to recognize the data, how to understand and protect the data. And then you need to have the technology to facilitate all of this, because what I'll go into a little bit later is without technology, you end up doing lots of manual processes, and it's very difficult to scale.
And do I do these programs in parallel, or is there a preferred sequencing?
I would definitely recommend doing these in a sequence. So starting with your data classification, that's really the core fundamental of understand that data. But then what a lot of people do is kind of go in parallel, understand, hey, I need to protect a certain amount of data and I need to understand the privacy around the data. So those two programs I definitely see, they complement each other, and most companies would try to do that in parallel after the data classification.
Excellent, thanks.
Yep. So now let me actually, let's take you down the lens of these three different programs and look at an example file. That's the best way to really explain this. So let's put on the lens of data classification. So I'm taking just an example file, a simple CSV file that's probably sitting out on everybody's network drive. So it's got names, it's got email addresses and physical addresses. So if I'm thinking of my data classification program, the first thing I'm thinking of, hey, does this fall into one of my data classification buckets? So is this, say, customer data, or is this public data, or is this maybe confidential data? Depending on my classification scheme, these questions will be slightly different, but they should all be very easy to answer questions that any user on your network should be able to identify right off the bat.
So,
now, yep.
So with these three different types of data, right? Mm-hmm. So different data classifications, do I come up with this with my entire team, or does it fall under a certain lead within my team?
Yeah, so, and here you really need this to come from top down. So you need to decide what your actual classification scheme needs to be that fits your business. Like I mentioned earlier, some businesses, say if you're in the healthcare vertical or obviously government, you're going to be handed down your data classification scheme that you need to implement in your organization. But if you're maybe a private company that's a lot less regulated, you should be able to come up with your own data classification scheme. And I usually recommend pulling in some outside consulting to help understand and basically get you these high level buckets where you should be placing your data into, and then look at what types of protection or what types of storage you should be doing for each types of data.
And then I think there are two questions that are sort of interrelated, which is, how long does process take? And then is there a point in time when I need to involve experts?
Yeah, so it's definitely one of those things. I see if companies could either deploy this very quickly. Obviously, if you want to pick a very simple scheme like this, where it's, hey, I just want to break it down into what should be public and what should be confidential. Obviously, that's something that can be deployed very quickly. It's when you need to start interpreting different regulations and adapting it into your business model and understanding, hey, this type of legal document, what does that really fall into? That's when you really need to involve that legal advice or interpretation, because that can be a pretty long process if you're talking about reclassifying millions of documents into lots of different buckets. But that's when I'd usually recommend getting that outside help, because if you do this in-house, involving all the stakeholders, people have a tendency to overcomplicate it, make too many buckets, and then it's hard to train your staff, and then the staff ends up utilizing a 3-bucket system like this and not actually utilizing your dozens and dozens of classification types. So it's definitely a balance.
Yeah, I can see how you could make it overwhelming as opposed to making it a path to get to a better place.
Yeah, exactly. So now if I take this to the next level, so going from data classification, now with the data loss prevention lens. So here, this is what people would commonly think of, hey, if I have this file here, now I'm thinking, well, does this count as PII, or obviously it's not PCI data because there is no credit card number in here, but this is name and contact information. So I might classify this as PII. And then I might need to think, hey, well, if this is customer PII, then that is sensitive to us, depending on my data classification scheme. And then I need to start thinking of, well, according to my classification scheme, if this is PII, I need to encrypt it, say at rest or in transit. So I need to think about, hey, if I'm emailing this, I need to actually encrypt it, or if it's unencrypted, I need to get it blocked, say at my gateway. And then things like, is this allowed to be copied to a USB drive? And if it is, then it needs to be an encrypted drive, things like that. And then I might start looking at how many users have access to this file. What are the access permissions? Is this in an open file share? So you're getting a lot more granular in what you have to and how you're going to treat this file. But it's still not as deep, you'll see, as when I'm looking at it through a privacy lens.
And so for folks who may not be as familiar with the term data loss prevention, I am assuming it includes stolen, disrupted, released, unintentionally lost, right? I mean,
exactly. So DLP, I traditionally think of as more, say, that accidental loss here. Also, you do want to prevent the malicious user stealing this data, but for the most part, you're thinking of minimizing the exposure. So minimizing how many users have access to it. Don't send it via unencrypted transmission, because then it could get exposed in that manner.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yep. So now let's look through the third lens. So look through the privacy lens. So you'll see here, first of all, the list of questions gets a lot longer, which a lot of people don't realize. I came from the DLP background. So when I started learning about privacy, I had no idea that these regulations were going so deep. So one of the things you're thinking of is, hey, if I'm in the marketing sense, hey, is this data? So are all of these names, addresses, and email addresses, can I sell this? Do we have permission from each of these users to sell this data? Do we even have the consent for us to have this data on file? And where is that consent record? I need to have the information for Hugo here. I need to have his consent record and exactly the timestamp that he said, yes, I want you to process this data. Then I also have to think of, where is this data stored? did we detect this in a SaaS application or a third party vendor? And then I have to think of, well, have we evaluated that vendor contract to show that we're allowed to store this type of data there and that they don't take ownership of the data when I store it there? And then also in the marketing sense, hey, can I start emailing and spamming these users with particular types of marketing email? And then there's the case of honoring the rights of each of these users to the data that's in this file. So what if Bradley here asks for a copy of the data that you have on file in not only this file, but every other database and file system you have on the network? Same thing, if Anne asks to be forgotten, now you have to know how to find this file, find her record, delete it, and do that over and over in every file that you have on the network as well as database. So you can see this has huge implications, and it's also the fact that you need to have very deep understanding of all the data in each of these files, not just the fact that this contains names, addresses, things like that.
So I think many of us have heard of, the new privacy laws in California and in the EU in particular. How technically informed are those new
Yeah,
policies and statutes?
it's tough. Definitely, I'd say on the business side. So businesses are definitely listening in. Everybody at some point has heard of GDPR and now CCPA and realizing we're going to need to start adapting to this. What's lagging behind is obviously the public knowledge that you can go to any of these businesses and you puts you in control of your data. The fact that you can go to a massive business, a massive company, and ask them, hey, I do business with you, or I have an account with you. I want to know all of the data that you've stored about me, not just the transactions that I've done with you, but all of the other marketing intelligence and say demographics that you've collected about me over time. And then if I want to, I should be able to ask you to delete all of that, or I can request that, hey, you don't sell copies of that data or sell my purchasing history to another organization. Or if I see that you have errors in what you've collected, I should be able to rectify it. And this isn't even the complete list of rights. This is kind of the ones that boil down that are similar across lots of different regulations.
Okay, so me as a risk professional, how can you do privacy without security?
Oh, they definitely still have to be hand in hand. So here, these aren't the only rights. These are the rights that you can exercise, but still all of the regulations still have built in saying you also have a responsibility to be protecting this data from disclosure, protecting it from mishandling and deletion. But what these regulations are more about, giving you the results of what you need to be providing, not necessarily going into details of here's exactly how the steps you need to follow in order to protect the data. So it's less prescriptive, like a PCI compliance, where they're telling you need to have this vulnerability policy, this antivirus policy. With the privacy regulations, you can tell they're more about, hey, if you get breached, then you actually need to notify all of the people that were breached within this tight timeline. So it's more telling you what you need to, your reactions, what you need to provide, not necessarily how you need to do it.
So your onerous responsibilities.
Exactly.
Therefore, you want to address this at the front end so that you're not in that position at the back end.
Exactly, that's correct. And what's interesting is that the current crisis, so the health crisis, it's only making things worse and making it harder for companies to catch up. So right now, everybody's going online more and more. More businesses are going online that have never had a web presence or never had a big e-commerce presence. So all of them, they're collecting a lot more data than they ever have. They have fewer budgets and resources, because they're, and I can assure you, nobody's doing unnecessary risk assessments and privacy assessments right now. So all it is they're getting further and further behind and going into this privacy debt, and they're going to have to eventually address this over time.
That's a really good point that I hadn't thought about. And And I'm a huge proponent of going more virtual, right, for medical services, because it's better than
Yep,
not getting it. And I
exactly.
guess
Yep,
we'll be going back, right, to a certain
yep,
degree.
that's exactly right.
And so figuring this out starting now, I think is really critical for all of us.
Exactly, exactly. So that's really why, and what really makes it important is that, even if a business wants to be a good steward of that data, it's really difficult to do those things, to have that
Mhm.
privacy lens on every file and database on your network, because that data is just going to be everywhere. Even if you're set up properly, you have different billing systems, marketing systems. That data on all of your consumers is going to spread. It has to, in order to transact these days. So even if I want to say, Terry, I want to be able to give you a copy of all of your data, so but I can't do that within 15 days, 30 days that I need to by law.
Mhm.
It's just too difficult. I don't have the manpower now. So I all I can do is turn to the same systems that I have available to me. So traditionally, how most privacy programs are working, they're going off of some sort of survey system. So they're saying, hey, I need to survey all of my business owners, all of my application owners. I'll send you a spreadsheet and you tell me what types of data do you have in your systems? Do you have customer data? Does this have employee data? Things like that. That's just the way that most organizations have to handle it. Or if they're a little bit more advanced, say if they're a financial, hey, I already have a DLP system, so I've been able to do a discovery, and I know where all the social security numbers and credit card numbers are in my entire network. Well, what about all of the names, addresses, and phone numbers and demographic
Mhm.
information, the other personal information that is part of your business? Oh,
Mhm.
well, you'll talk to the DLP admin, and they'll say, "Oh, no, we have exclusions for all names, addresses, phone numbers because it causes too many false positives." So then people realize that they have a massive gap, and they still have no idea where their actual customer data is. And then if you're a large business with a large consumer base, well, how do you actually manage if people start actually requesting for copies of their data? So what people lean towards is some sort of ticketing system. They'll take their ServiceNow ticketing system and start making it customer facing. But now they have all this customer data getting input into their IT ticketing system, and they're just making the problem worse. They're spreading customer information now into other IT systems. And then what they do is they button all this together and duct tape it together, and they call this their privacy program. Um, not knocking it, but it's just not scalable. As each of these regulations comes out, you'll see each of the rights are slightly different. So if you're a global company and you have consumers from all over the world, each exercising slightly different rights, there's no way anybody can manage this, and it's definitely just not scalable to in today's business world.
So it's funny, Greg, because I look at
Mhm.
something like this and I just see opportunity, which is
Yeah,
literally skip echelon to the next comprehensive approach and actually save a ton in legacy tool costs, in manpower that you have, right? Doing a lot of
yeah.
these manually intensive, approaches, and, you got to get out of this fast.
Exactly, exactly. And especially with these rights, we're not talking about low-level people that end up managing these processes. These are usually lawyers or well-educated, very experienced people. So these are high-dollar people getting paid to do very, very manual processes, to deal with
Mm,
spreadsheets, interpret
mhm.
results, and make communications and legal arguments back and forth.
Right.
So this is why we actually decided we need to come to the market with a platform that addresses this entire problem with a full solution, rather than attack one little pain point here, one little point here.
Right.
So that's really why we decided we're going to build a platform that's all about really automating privacy ops. So building an entire platform around an operations framework for privacy. But what we've realized is it really needs to be built on data intelligence. So back to that privacy lens, looking at that file, you need to have that level of detail on every file, every database, every asset on your network, and have that data intelligence. And that way, you can apply this back to privacy. You can roll back towards DLP type of policies, as well as data classification. Because if you can get down that level of detail on a file, it's easy to move to the left and look at the simpler aspects of each file.
So do I have to be brilliant to implement something like this?
No, definitely not. So we definitely recommend, we have basically a crawl, walk, run approach to actually getting this deployed. So we definitely recommend starting out slow and then starting to increase as you go into our different applications. So basically our platform, like I said, it's centered around this data intelligence. And when we say data intelligence, I mean the fact that what I do is I take my background here and I connect into all of the actual applications on your network. So I'll connect into your SaaS applications, your on-premise applications, your structured data. So think of data in a file server or an S3 bucket, as well as the structured data. So databases, the SaaS applications that have a table structure. And what we'll do is we'll use our AI technology. So that's the key, is that we're using our AI technology, not the legacy type of DLP detection. And then we'll detect all of the personal data elements in each of those repositories that we're connected to. So from there, I can actually build you a data inventory telling you, hey, out of all your assets that we've connected to, here are the ones that contain personal data, and here are the types of personal data in each of those elements. So we can satisfy that initial data mapping and data inventory right out of the gates. So you don't have to, worry about which assets you need to protect the most. We'll tell you the ones that you should be most concerned about. Then what we can do is take it a step further, is now once I've identified, hey, here are all the personal data elements in this application, then what we can do is start to do a mapping of what personal data we found and tying it back to the identity that owns that data. So for instance, if I look in a database and I start finding a table that's full of names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, each of those records belongs to one identity. Now I can take a hash of each of those elements in that record. And now if I find that same social security number, say in another file, in an unstructured file, I can take a hash of that social security number, match it up with that database record, and I can start to build a giant mesh, kind of map for every identity stored on your network. So basically, the more and more we scan, the bigger and bigger each of those identity meshes gets. So that way you can start to understand, oh, I have employee data over here, I have customer data over here, and I can see how it spiders across all of my different.
It's kind of like data reconnaissance.
Think of it like that. So the greatest thing is the more and more you scan, the more detailed and inventory you can get. Now what you can start to do is we can start to layer on our actual privacy automation technologies to make use of that data map. So it's one thing to understand, hey, where's the data? But now it's another thing to start enabling the rights of the data owners. So the first thing that we can do is give you a portal and basically a management framework for you to manage your data subject rights requests. So this is the case where we can spin up basically a portal that you can link to right on your website. Then consumers or even employees can come to that portal and request, say, a copy of all their data or request to have all their data deleted. We can handle the identity verification.
Wow.
So we'll validate the user.
So like if you lose an employee or lose a client or a patient or whatever, then that it doesn't remain, correct?
Correct. So what it is that if that user comes in and says, hey, I need a copy of all my data, that we can actually robotically automate the fulfillment by searching that data graph. So basically searching that map, say, oh yeah, I have all of your data, I have bits and pieces of your data in this database. It can grab copies of all of it, assemble it into a proper report that you can review, and then send that report back to the user. And we'll
Right.
handle all of the encrypted communications back and forth. Because that's
Wow.
often something people don't realize, is that if they're accepting a request via email, then they have to get all this sensitive data back to, a consumer's Gmail account, and they're working out encryption keys and all of that. So the fact that we give you a perfect framework for that, and end-to-end
Mhm.
communications, and then
Mhm.
also the logging and history that, hey, this user submitted the request, we responded to it. Please,
Mm.
they can't sue us because we have the record that that they got their request fulfilled. Then what we can also do is move into things like consent. So consent is very important when you're starting to collect consumers' data, because you have to make sure that you're keeping a record of, hey, when John Smith submitted their data or made a purchase with us, he checked the box saying yes, he consents to us storing this data, using it for marketing purposes, or XYZ. So we allow you to capture all of that consent. Same thing with cookie consent. Hey, John Smith accepted that we're going to drop cookies and start tracking his browsing behavior on our website. So we give you that mechanism to store all of those consent records on our platform, so you don't have to worry about it, collecting it from multiple different locations.
So I'm assuming that obviously the highly regulated industries and sectors are the types that would need this kind of capability. Are there certain sectors you can't support?
No, really any sector. So really any sector collecting consumer information, they could end up
Okay.
being subject to, say, CCPA or GDPR. They'd really have to look at, hey, do I meet the thresholds, especially for CCPA, do I meet the thresholds of my minimum revenues, or where my location of my consumers are? So they really need to be aware of that, or where are my users browsing from? Because you need to honor, everybody's website by default is going to be accessible from to the globe. So you need to consider, if I have people browsing from the EU, I might need to start adhering to GDPR laws. So it's going to be very important to be, especially on the consent side,
Right.
to be
From
to
from
have
a
the proper.
from a use case standpoint, would this have helped Equifax?
I don't think on the consent side, not
No,
really. That, I mean, the Equifax was definitely around the actual protection of the data,
I
vulnerability
I
management,
gotcha.
things like that.
This is upfront.
I don't think it would. I don't think it would have passed to say, hey, we gathered consent that you will allow us to to have your data breached. So I don't. That won't really work.
Sorry, I got us off
But
the wrong.
definitely, that's okay. But definitely with the breach notifications, according to, so breach notification laws is slightly different in each regulation. So you'll have different timelines when you're
Mm,
required to notify on breaches.
okay,
Otherwise, now you'll be in further violation of
right.
say GDPR. So what we're doing is we're spinning up an entire breach module to help you analyze. Hey, if
Mm,
this database were breached,
mm,
how many folks will we need to notify, and then what will we need to tell them that was breached?
okay.
A lot
So
of
it did
times.
you on the response side, obviously.
Exactly, this is more breach notification.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you reacting after you got
Mm-hmm.
breached? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people don't realize that that's a very short time window
Yes.
between when you are aware that something was breached and you immediately have to notify, if you want to stay compliant. So it's important to have the framework, the knowledge in place ahead of time. It's not like you can go out and look for a product to help with this after you've been breached. It's not going to work.
Okay.
All right. And then we have to start thinking about, hey, if I have this data, I might end up sharing it or reselling it out to other vendors. And now I need to make sure that they're compliant with these regulations and they're treating
Mhm.
data properly. So here we give you a framework to, again, assess your vendors, again, all programmatically. So be able to send them an assessment, a digital assessment. They fill it out online, actually submit the requests, upload their SOC 2, compliance records, their PDFs, and now you have a complete record that they are compliant, and then you can reassess them automatically each year. So here, this is again Another place where most people are doing this via spreadsheets with lots of questions and having to collate the responses and keep track of it all. So just having this in a web page form is a huge time saver. And then the same thing. Oh, sorry.
No. When you're ready, there are a few questions that have come in, and I'll throw them at
you. Okay. Yeah, I just have one more little bullet on this slide.
Yep.
So on the internal side, you have the same thing. You need to fill out lots of different assessments. There's lots of questionnaires that need to go out to your asset owners or to process owners, business owners. And you'll definitely need to evaluate either risk assessments or impact assessments. And then what we can also do is help you track any of the remediations that you need to do. So if you flag that, hey, this application is a risk right now because they're handling data a certain way, well, you need to, the most important part is tracking the risk and remediating that and tracking, your actual, residual risk levels. So we give you an entire platform and framework to help track all of those assessments internally. And then the key is that all of these modules I've been talking about, they roll up and they're in one platform. So these aren't individual products you need to deploy each time. These are just modules that you can turn up as you're ready to deploy them. And we give you a deployment methodology, like I said, to help you crawl, walk, run as you deploy this, because nobody can deploy this all at once in parallel processes and deploy it all at once. You definitely need to go through a learning process, get your people and processes built up around this technology, and in order to recognize and reduce that risk over time.
So when you were showed the slides on, how it is done today, right? The manual legacy approach. Of those legacy approaches, does this replace everything but the people managing it?
I'd say we want to replace that entire process. So all of those different silos there, you should really be able to replace it with one technology, but then be able to use this technology for lots of other uses. And then the idea is we also do want to reduce, I don't want to eliminate jobs, but we definitely should be able to reduce the manual processes. Most people will want to redirect those highly skilled folks to more important duties than collating spreadsheets, things like that.
Exactly. And I was thinking through, it might be fun to discuss a couple of use cases. So if, and tell me if it's the wrong use case, but a small clinic, a local clinic, or a law firm, what would it take, something that's not huge enterprise, right?
Yeah.
What would it take to implement something like this end to end?
So even a small business, I see benefits in automation from small businesses to really large organizations. So keep in mind with the small business, the amount of, say, people coming in and requesting access to their data might be very small, but at the same time, you don't want to have to dedicate an entire member of staff that's just answering these data subject rights requests. So having a system that can automatically take care of the notifications, the reminders of when it needs to be fulfilled, it's a lot easier to be managed by a single person. So a single person can easily manage every aspect of privacy in a small organization like that. But at the same time, as it grows, you can start to dole out and actually divide out the labor. So even responding to the DSRs, you can kind of split those tasks out and say, hey, if it's an employee that requests it, we'll assign this to HR and offload some of that from a person. So we make it as flexible as possible to fit those both small business as well as large enterprise, where you might have a team of people collaborating on all DSRs or have multiple vendor managers handling hundreds of vendors. So either way, you can really benefit from the automation.
Okay, and going back a little bit to the beginning, so when you talked about the data classification, the data loss prevention, and then the data privacy, this platform is helping you to implement all of those?
Yes. So what we're going to do is today we're focused mainly on the data privacy segment. But
Okay.
as you can see, is once you have that, if I have that level of detail on, say, every file or database on the network, I already know I can move easily back, I'd say to the left, think on that slide. I can move easily back into those other aspects. So over the next few months, we're going to have releases where we'll actually have more DLP-like capabilities. And it's a very easy pivot for us because we already have this understanding of, hey, exactly what types of data are in all of these files. So now it's just a case of, well, now let's start looking at the access rights and show you the risks of having these files, say, with too much access. And then we can start to move into things like, well, now if you're already moved up into Office 365, well, let's maybe utilize the Microsoft tagging and help you tag your files and classify your files since we've already discovered them. So we're going to start to slowly move into those aspects because it's such an easy pivot for us. Whereas, a tagging solution would have a very hard time trying to pivot into DLP and into privacy because they just don't have the granularity that's required.
Okay, so this focus by design was on the privacy side, but
Correct.
similarly, we can use the platform to dig into the data classification and the data loss.
Correct. That's definitely what we want to move
Cool.
towards.
So all in one, 3 minutes in
Yes.
one.
So that's the whole idea is that, hey, you should get this in because of privacy, but at the same time utilize it for everything data protection wise.
Okay. So one last question so we can tie it with a bow. And then if there's anything else that you wanted to highlight that you weren't able to do. I think folks have a hard time thinking through the jewels of their business from a data standpoint.
Mhm.
Is there any high level, recommendations that you have so as they start this journey?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what a lot of people end up going back to, really DLP centric, is, hey, what's going to cause you the most financial impact? Because that can be tied back to
Mm-hmm.
my intellectual property being leaked, or my manufacturing techniques, as well as now there's direct impacts of if I leak customer data or employee data, those are going to have direct implications because of breach law, because of the actual monetary cost of losing each record. So that still holds true. Go back to what's going to cost me the most in either brand or fines or direct sales, and that usually
Yeah.
helps people
Yes.
spark, and that way you're not wasting time protecting things that really aren't important or only had the perception of being important. Really tie it back to that money.
Yeah, perfect. I normally in the big picture of risk, right, talk to revenue and reputation.
Yeah.
And right, if you can tie it to that, then prioritize based on impact to those two things and start there.
Exactly.
Perfect. Anything
Great.
else you want to mention? I think we've
um,
gone through all the questions.
okay, great. No, I think that was it. That was great talking with you today. I appreciate the questions that came in from everybody and yourself. I think this was a good discussion.
Awesome. I look forward to doing this again because you're that rare combination of solution architect and extraordinarily articulate. So thank you.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Have a
All right.
great rest of your day.